All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate, yeah, another strong group of participants in our line of Zoom tastings. Things are getting much better, and this is still an incredible way to reach a lot of people. I mean, a lot of us are not even in the Chicago area, downstate, but Chicagoland is also a pretty big area. So it's really nice to be able to reach everyone and taste these wines together while, being in different places. Hopefully soon, we have a few in-person tastings in the books. One in particular I'm excited about is we have a vertical Leonetti that I've squirreled away. I'm just trying to figure out the last few details, but I'm really excited about that, especially after I just got back from Walla Walla and visiting Leonetti and was there with the Figgins family, and it was an incredible visit, and really to deep dive into that heritage would be really fun time. So I hope you guys can join us with that. Before we get started, I did want to mention, please use the chat function for any questions. We have a few too many participants to allow speaking or videos, so please utilize the chat function for those. And anyone who's not the the panelists, Gerard, Simon, or I will just monitor that and try to bring it up to whoever's speaking so we can answer them real time. The other thing I want to mention is after tasting these wines, we've decided to switch up the lineup a teeny bit, just from seeing how they're showing tonight. We're going to start still with the Nebbiolos, the Nervi and the Scavino, but the second and third set, we're actually going to switch. So we're going to start with the second set, we're going to start with the Etna Rosso and go to the Mastroberardino, the Taurasi, and then we're going to end with the San Leonardo and the Ornellaia. And you'll see why. So I'm super excited. As many of you know, my name is Silas Morgan. I hail from Portland, Oregon. I've been with the company, Chicago Wine Company, now for just over 2 years. And yeah, and I'm really excited to share wine with people. As many of you know, it's a huge passion of mine. So, and I actually come from a geology background, so and you'll see I tend to lean on maps for a lot of my understanding of wines. It's definitely, I think, a great way to look at wine. So let's see if you agree with me. So today I have the exciting pleasure of showing two different Nebbiolos from the same different regions of northern Italy. So we're going to start with the Nervi Conterno in your glass. And I might just start by smelling the wine personally, and then as we learn more about it, kind of revisiting it as we access it. But having an initial impression for a wine, I think, is really nice. Right off the bat, I get tart cherry, maybe some tea leaves, maybe some black tea. If any of you know tea, I'm thinking even a little earthiness, so maybe a pu'er, maybe a little pu'er. I hope someone got that. Oh yeah, it's really nice and fruity. It's sweet on the nose, but also really aromatic. I'm excited to see how that tastes. But so Nervi Conterno is an appended name. So it's the Nervi Winery, and it was founded in 1902. So it's the longest running winery in Gattinara, which is the region where it's situated. And what's exciting is it actually dates back even further. The family holdings are from the 1600s. And this region is one of the oldest planted regions in the area. It dates back to Roman times, and for many, many, many centuries was considered one of the greatest vineyard sources in the entirety of northern Italy. So really, really top-notch stuff, and for many years was far superior to anything coming out of Barolo, which is surprising nowadays. The unfortunate thing is phylloxera, the root louse that decimated much of Europe, really dealt it a strong blow, and replanting was slow. They started intermixing other varieties than Nebbiolo, which is the proud grape of northern Italy, and the only grape used to make this wine. So they started intermixing other varieties, and their quality suffered. They started making young, approachable wines and kind of really moving away from this, storied tradition of these age-worthy, beautiful, delicate wines. So I'm going to show you a map of this area of Gattinara. So here we have Italy, as you can see, in the classic boot. And we're going to go up to the Alps, way up in northern Italy. So this is Gattinara. And they call this area Alto Piemonte. So Piedmont means the foot of the mountain. And as you can see, I'm just going to kind of give you a nice little oblong view of this area. We're literally at the foot of the Alps. And it's a really, it's an incredible place. If you've ever been to any of these valleys, when you drive up to the Alps, you are in the low, flat plain of the Po River, and it's agriculture. It feels like the Midwest a little bit. Just heavy agriculture, pretty darn flat, and then you kind of approach these sheer slopes that herald the beginning of the Alps. And so Gattinara, you can see the hills just all of a sudden pop out of nowhere, and you can see literally the collection of the vineyards of Gattinara. And they cling to these steep hillsides just west of the town, just northwest. And it's an exciting area. The slopes, as you can see, varied aspect, but all pretty darn steep, mostly south facing with some western exposure. In most places, they say that east facing is usually the best because it catches the morning sunlight. And there is many places facing due north now where there is a lot of east facing, but there's also great west facing slopes here because the high elevation keeps everything so cool that the late afternoon sunlight that is too warm in many areas is actually beneficial to ripening a lot of these grapes. So because we're so close to the Alps, you do get a cooler climate. The afternoon tends to cool off and the night becomes very cool. And what that does is retain quite a bit of acidity. And I think we can visit the wine now a little bit. So, I mean, it is really high tone is what I think of when I think of, Alpine wines. And so Alto literally means high. So Alto Piemonte, this is the high foot of the mountains. So this is, a region that tends to be a little cooler than Barolo. I think creates more high tone, more aromatic wines sometimes. And Barolo can be extremely aromatic, but this is aromatic driven. It doesn't have maybe the concentration that a lot of Barolos rely on. And oh, that's a lovely wine. Absolutely lovely. So the Nervi family owned this winery for a long time until they sold it to a German steel conglomerate who then passed it on to a group of Norwegian investors. And they finally sold a few years ago to the famous Conterno family. And as many of you know, the Conterno family is one of the greatest producers in Barolo. So when they went all the way to Gattinara to make a large vineyard purchase, it turned a lot of heads. I mean, it was a big deal and still is a big deal. Gattinara, has long been, since phylloxera and kind of the downturn of Gattinara, has been considered kind of backwater of Barolo and the Barbaresco, kind of the kings of modern Nebbiolo. But this was a huge endorsement of the area, and I think the wines really show that. It's it has beautiful concentration, but it has this delicacy, this aromatic intensity that is really nice. It reminds me of Barbaresco, more so I think than Nebbiolo, but it has its own character quite a bit. Oh, that's yummy. Oh, I could drink that all day. I'm going to save a little bit in the glass to come back to, but also to compare it to the Barolo. I think this is a really interesting comparison because they are similar areas in the country and similar landscapes, but very different wines. So while we're on the map, I'm going to zoom over to Barolo. And actually, while we're here, Alto Piemonte is actually a scattered area of vineyards. So as you saw, Gattinara was this, pretty intense cluster of vineyards. I mean, it's really not a big area. The rest of it becomes forested pretty quickly. But what's cool, and let me share this, is it's actually a collection. Can everyone see this new map, Gerard?
Yep, all good.
Great. So Gattinara, as you can see, is just a little nugget of great, choice vineyard site right at the beginning of the Alps. But there's also these other, these other regions right next door that make great wine. And if you can find the bottles, they're pretty hard to locate sometimes. Phenomenal value for the quality and really, really interesting wines. You do see more of those native varieties creep in, so it's not going to be always a pure expression of Nebbiolo, but for the adventurous, I highly recommend some of these smaller appellations. All right, back to Google Maps. All right, so we're heading south a little bit, but we're not moving too far from the mountains because the Alps, they actually wrap around to the south. Okay, there it is. So as you can see, the Alps kind of wrap around here. It's a what it is a continent on continent juncture. So it's literally popping up the mountain. The mountains are knuckling up because the crust is just too brittle to go, anywhere else. It can't subduct. It can't go underneath the other plate very easily. And so it kind of, just similar to the Himalayas, it creates this really drastic boundary of mountains right where the collision happens. So, I mean, as you can hear, I'll just zoom out. You can see the boundary. There it is.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool place. If you've never been to the Alps, I went a few years ago to do the Tour de Mont Blanc, and it's a magical place, especially when you get really far up. So here again, we're at the foot of the mountains. This is proper Piedmont. It's not quite as high as Alto Piemonte, but it's a pediment. It's a foot of the mountain. And what's really cool is you can kind of see there's a lot, just even from space, there's a lot less forest, because this area, as you're about to see, has been planted heavily. So as you zoom in, you start noticing the forest disappears when you get to Barolo. And that's because every single inch of plantable surface is vineyard. And it is, you could consider it's an ecological disaster, but the wines are too delicious to say those words. So I won't go down that route. So yeah, I mean, literally every surface that's, legitimately plantable, the forest still clinging to the lower reaches where it's just, you get too much moisture, you get too much disease pressure. You're not going to plant down there, not enough exposure to sunlight to ripen grapes. But everything above that, everything that has really nice exposure is going to be totally planted with predominantly Nebbiolo. In past times, there's also a grape called Freisa that uses the same, likes the same sites, the same characteristics. But as Nebbiolo has gained prominence, it's all but disappeared. GD Vira makes a beautiful Freisa, if anyone's interested. All right, so we are in the literal heart of Barolo. So we have Serralunga de Alba here. This is the classic, I'll share a quick picture. This is the iconic city of Barolo. And you see a lot of photos of this beautiful old, I believe it's a monastery with the Alps on a clear day behind it. It's a really beautiful place. I'm a huge fan. And it's a classic kind of reference point for really big structured Nebbiolo. You tend to get, a lot of tar, rose hip, but also this kind of roaring tannin that is pretty formidable in its youth, and takes years to kind of ameliorate, to sweeten up, to kind of integrate into the profile of really dense fruit underneath. And here, just north of it is the hill of Cerreto. And this is, you can see, sorry, Cerreto. So you can see it's a huge conical peak. And we're just on this wine comes from the vineyard of Prato, which is just on the northern slope. It has, and so we're going to taste that now. Let's give it a smell. Oh yeah, it's already, I think rounder on the nose, less high toned. Let's see what chat, what's going on. Yeah, I'm a huge fan. It's sweet, but in a different way. I would say the other one had a little bit more sweet cherry, while this is more darker fruit, plum. Oh, that's really nice. Maybe get a little bit of heat on this. A little in not in a distracting way, but maybe a little bit of perceptible alcohol. Nebbiolo is a thin-skinned grape, but it tends to, as other thin-skinned grapes do, and it approaches ripeness, tends to accumulate a lot of sugar. So when, in warmer years, especially, or when people are just trying to achieve ripeness in, era of climate change, they tend to get high alcohols in Barolo. So this is from Paolo Scavino, and this is really great. This is now the 4th generation of Scavinos that run it. And it's woman-led, which is really exciting for this region. Not very usual. And they make, I think, I wouldn't call it iconic wines, but they make just reference points. I would say reference points. They don't lean towards any particular, I think, camp of, heavy traditionalist with a lot of, volatile acidity, or, culty wines. But they also don't, throw a ton of new oak on these wines. They do use, small barriques, which, if anyone knows, traditional Barolo was raised in these like giant botti, these, ancient Slovenian oak casks that had, their great grandfathers had made. The move to modernism was really using small oak barriques from France predominantly. So what they use, what we're more familiar with in the United States. So they definitely use those. They still use botti. They use Fuder, which are oversized but not quite as big as the botti. Let's take a gander at this wine with that in mind. So not modernist, not super traditionalist. I would say just really pretty Nebbiolo, pretty Barolo. Ooh, wow. That's pretty. But the tannin is there. I mean, and that's what Serralonga and Cerreto is really known for, is this structure. And when people talk about structure, a lot of people leap to tannin, and the tannin's there. There's also gorgeous acidity. And when we talk about structure, we talk about, the supporting kind of components of a wine that make it, ageable, that make it food friendly, that you think of a hot year modern Chateau Neuf, it maybe doesn't have the acid or the tannin we see here, but it has the density of fruit. That's another form of structure. The sheer extract of some wines can be a component of structure. So with this, I would say the structure is mostly tannin, but beautiful acid, and also fruit. There's fruit, but it's tight. It's really wrapped up in there. Oh, when I give that a swirl, it just gets even more aromatic. And this has the kind of the more classic bouquet I think of when I think of Barolo. Has that rose hip, has that tar. It not overwhelmingly so. I mean, that's going to come out more with age. More truffle characteristics that tertiary Barolo knows. But this is already pretty for 2016, which usually I don't touch Barolo for. I don't touch Barolo that's younger than 2 decades. This because some of the, especially at 2016, this was heralded as a classic year, where it was relatively cool, late ripening. So that means that you get really prolonged physiological development, and that gives you these more layered nuances. but what that tends to mean is also hefty tannin development. But I think this is pretty darn approachable. We have one question. Can you explain how acidity comes across or is experienced in the wine? I get acidity mostly in it kind of triggers the salivary glands. So you talk about mouth-watering acidity, and it's tends to be that kind of tartness, that kind of bite that's not drying. I think the tannin's more of a tongue, more of a mid-palate experience. The tannins are I think slightly not stripping, but you do feel them kind of taking a little bit of the proteins out of your mouth and taking it away. But what do you guys think? What characteristics do you look for when we talk about acidity or nice acid, as I'm talking about in this experience?
And for me, something that I've always said, not just with these wines, but almost with any red wines, when they're young, I look for some acidity. I want some acidity to go with the tannins and the fruit, because as the wine ages, all of those will come together as a whole. And the acidity itself is, as I think Silas has mentioned, it's a freshness of acidity. It's not a mouth-searingly lemon juice acidity that will just catch the side of your mouth. It is all part of the structure of the wine that makes it lively. And it's not a cumbersome wine. It's not all fruit and all tannins. There's this nice freshness, which we look for whenever we're tasting relatively young or younger red wines.
Yeah, no, I think that you guys both hit the nail on the head. And, I would have just simply used the word, bright, like just, bright and fresh. And, when you have that acidity combined with the tannin, I mean, that's a recipe for a wine that's not only going to be enjoyable now, but stands a good chance of developing and getting better in the cellar. Sometimes the easiest way to understand what something is to have something that's not. And where I'm going with that is sometimes when you have wines that are just very out of balance, and frankly, sometimes when you get into some very, very ripe Chateauneufs or some very, very ripe wines from California, they just feel heavy. They're not refreshing. They feel almost like have a liqueur-ish kind of quality to it, and they lack that acidity. And that to me tells me that the wine's out of balance. The wine's probably, there's nothing, it's not to say that the wine can't be enjoyed. It's just, it doesn't bode well for its future prospects, because, some of that acidity is what's going to carry the wine and allow the tannins to kind of mellow out and develop. So yeah, I think you guys both nailed it. And, without question, I mean, these two wines have it in spades, especially I think the Scavino, but just Italian wines in general. I mean, they're bright, they're typically fresh. The ABVs are lower, which is a good segue there. I don't know, maybe that's a question for Silas, if you know the two ABVs on these.
Yes, before I left, the Gattinara, the Nervi Conterno, is 13. And that's a function of the higher elevation. You're not going to get that kind of sugar accumulation from the heat. The Scavino is 14.5. So you're going to get that sugar accumulation. It is a riper wine. I think it's aromatically, I think it's more developed. If anyone has their wine still in their glass, I highly recommend just smelling and tasting it. I mean, it's night and day, and it's crazy because it's, we're talking about similar regions, similar soils, similar climates, one's cooler, but ultimately, the same grape. It's wild. The terroir is so pronounced. One thing I would say about acidity, and Gerard, you rightly said, when people push towards ripeness, you get higher alcohol, but you also get less acidity. It's because the acid is called tartaric acid, and it actually breaks down in the presence of heat. So when you try to push wines, especially in hotter New World climates, like say Paso, you get less and less acidity and higher alcohols. So some of those Paso, Syrahs, you're going to be 16% alcohol, and they're relying almost sheerly on the wholly on the density of fruit. Yeah. And what acid they do have is almost always added. I will tell you that now. I have worked in wineries, and I have dumped a lot of tartaric acid into wines that were pushed too far. That were they were more worried. They were, I think, more worried about obtaining a fruit profile than I think achieving a natural balanced wine. And that's sometimes a function of a year, and people make those choices. So it's, and a lot of people do. A lot of people do.
And I think going back to my point about the acidity and the freshness, now that we know this is 14.5, I'm sure all of you have had wines from other regions at 14.5 that don't have the freshness to them. They're cumbersome, they're almost clumsy. And I think that's what I was trying to refer to with the acidity and the freshness, that if you put this against a 14.5 wine from a much warmer climate, this is fresh, the other one would be cumbersome.
Yeah.
This is what we look for.
I totally agree. And there's like some, alcohol, because it's a thin string grape and similar to Pinot Noir, you can get high alcohols, pretty quickly. And that doesn't mean that acid necessarily drops very, because Barolo is still high elevation. And to answer your question, Rob, Barolo is 100% Nebbiolo as well.
By law.
By law, yeah. And what's interesting is, these wines are lovely. I lost my train.
I think that I do need to jump in and say, so as a collective, I mean, we definitely all contribute and put our 2 cents in as far as the pairings and everything like that. But by and large, a lot of these, Silas is the brainchild on a lot of these, and he deserves a ton of credit because I think even with the flight that's upcoming, in a little bit here, I couldn't think of like just 2 great wines to represent Bordeaux varietals in Italy. But these 2 here, I mean, this is just a really, really cool pairing where the wines are, I mean, they just obviously make sense to go together for obvious reasons, but there's just such a cool contrast. I think that to me, I think that Nervi is actually showing a little bit more rustic, and the Barolo is ever so slightly, I mean, it is by no means modern whatsoever, but it's surprisingly approachable and enjoyable. And like I was saying, for 2016 Barolo, which, I mean, his signature line is now going to be, I only drink 20-year-old Barolo. But, I think that it's super cool. I mean, obviously 2016 is a fantastic vintage, but to have some approachability here and to be able to taste these 2 wines, side by side, just super cool and just a really, really nice pairing here. And I like both wines for different reasons. I think to Ken's point, the Scavino is just, to me, it's just got a wild nose. I mean, there's a lot going on there. It's explosive, and there's a lot of stuff that I can't even pinpoint. And it's one of those wines where, it sounds so wine geeky to say, oh man, I could smell this wine all night. I could smell this wine all night. I mean, it's one of those things that just keeps on changing and developing, and it's going to probably do that for the rest of the night. And needless to say, I mean, for many, many more years to come. But no, 2 really, really good wines. So well done, Silas.
Yeah, and I always think before we move on, I love like a wine that keeps smelling the glass afterwards. And it's really good. That's like the marker of a really good wine for me.
Yeah. I was about to say that because I'm just using 2 of these special glasses for the tasting, and I poured over what was left into another glass so I could start again. And as you said, the hallmark, with nothing in the glass that you could possibly drink. There's just a drop in the bottom, and the aromas come out fantastically. This is what I think about with any great, not just red wine, but red in particular, that an empty glass, you can sit there and you can continue to enjoy the aromas of this long after you've consumed all that was in the glass.
To that point, I would say just as a general kind of, wine rule, I would say don't be afraid to short pour yourself and the people that you're with, in the sense of, obviously the wine's not going anywhere, so don't overfill the glass, and just have a just a little bit is enough to enjoy and savor, and you get so much more out of it. Even just with a little bit in the glass, it just allows the aromatics to really build and build and build, and just to your point, Simon, like you said, I mean, sometimes even that's just an empty glass is just wildly aromatic. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
With that, I'm happy to pass it off and
one other point that I would like to make about Nebbiolo. If you look at the color of these 2 wines, in particular the Gattinara, which is same age, but it's light in color, which is quite often very typical of Nebbiolo, and Pinot Noir, as you probably know. So it doesn't have to be a red wine that's deep in color to make it a good or even complex wine. Far from it.
And structured for that matter. Sometimes you look at Nebbiolo and you know, kind of somebody unfamiliar with, you know, Italian wines or Nebbiolo for that matter, they think that it's going to be a very lighter and easier drinking wine, and suffice to say, it's very often not. So.
No, lovely wines.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so we're going to move on to the next two.
Yeah.
Alice, do we have before we did we load up any polls, or did we? Do
Oh
we not
yeah.
have that?
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me. Yep. Let's do a poll, just real quick, of who likes what. So yeah, please vote for your favorite wine, and I'll share the results. It was a clear favorite here. I'll share. All right. Here we go. Everyone can see this. So yeah, clear favorite here, Scavino. I'm not too surprised. The Nervi is a wonderful wine, but it is their baseline wine. I mean, the Gattinara, just their straight Gattinara, is you know, a solid $20 cheaper than the Scavino, and the Conternos haven't been wholly in charge of the process yet. They only bought it in 2018, which it means they blended this wine, but they didn't vinify it. So, you know, by the time we get to 2018, that's going to be the first vintage that they've, you know, wholly made themselves. So very excited when that comes along. But at the same time, this is a wonderful wine, I think, for the price. The Scavino, at the same time, it is the single vineyard. It's one of the top sites. It really is, you know, the crown jewel. You know, one of his better, her better sites that they make.
I think to have, you know, the Nervi show the character that it does, you know, relative to its price, and sure, I mean, obviously going up against the Barolo, it's going to have a tougher task, both in the glass and kind of in our perception too. But I think the Nervi just has a ton of character and personality, and I think it was a really good showing for both. I think the Barolo did exactly, you know, what I expected Scavino to do. I think the Nervi really punched above its weight and made it a closer bout. You know, they didn't quite go to the scorecards, but they, you know, he went on to, you know, round 9 or 10 before he got knocked out. He didn't just fall flat in the third round.
I have to agree. It's night and day.
But neither heavyweight. They're both well, using the boxing analogy, what would that be? Welterweight or something, maybe?
There you go. Yes.
All right, Simon, you want to take it off?
Yes. Okay, so from the very northwest of Italy and up by the Alps, we're going to head way south. And just to remind you both again, all of you again, the lineup that we originally had announced, we switched around. So I'm doing the Etna Rosso and the Terrassi, and I'm going to start with the Etna Rosso down in Sicily, because having opened these wines, and you can see for yourself, just looking at the color of these two, why that's probably a logical way to go. So let me see if I'm not too technically challenged this time, and find some maps which I'd like to be able to share with you. But as usual, struggling. Okay. Let's try again. Sorry, guys. I need my share screen, and I'm not getting it. All right. You know what? I'm going again.
You're not able to share, or
I don't seem to be able to. And in fact, I've.
you should be able to. Down below, just hover down.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Try again. Okay, Sicily, the island of Sicily. So way south, obviously, as you know, off the southern tip of Italy. In fact, this portion way down here of Sicily is further south than parts of North Africa, just geographically speaking. And Sicily is an island that is steeped in history for both civilization with the Greeks and the Romans and beyond that, and also with wine. And wine's been made in Sicily for thousands of years, mainly more in this area here, which was just basically agricultural land where they grew grapes and made very ordinary wine. And it was discovered maybe 20 years or so ago that here at Mount Etna and around the tip of Mount Etna, here's the peak. Mount Etna is the highest mountain highest volcano in Europe at about 11,000 feet. And the appellation or the DOC of Etna Rosso is all of this region here that's covered in blue, that's circled in blue. And for the longest time, most of the red wines that we saw coming out of Etna, the Etna Rossos, were from the east and the southern slopes of the mountain. And if I can zoom in just a little bit, there we go. And up here in the north is where the wine from tonight is coming from, and some of the most exciting reds that we'll see from Etna, from the whole of the island, in fact, for I think many years to come. The wine tonight is from vineyards on the slopes just by the village here of Passo Peschiaro, from a property that is run by the Grassi family. The Grassi's estate is organic, and there's elevations between about 1,800 and 3,000 feet, where the climate is cooler and allowing obviously for more optimal ripening. What is significant is that the soils around here are, of course, very heavily volcanic, and the volcanic ash and the disintegrated pumice from the eruptions from this still active volcano are such that in certain areas around here, they are still able to grow ungrafted vines because the pest phylloxera is not able to survive in the soil and therefore not affect the vines itself. So here, a rather small picture, unfortunately, but you can get a good idea of the vineyards, and up there with the plumes of smoke coming from it is Mount Etna itself. The owner of the property, Alberto Grassi, was originally from the Sicilian farming family, but he left to study in Rome and then went on to Milan to work as an investment banker. But following the death of his grandfather, he returned to the island in 2004. And in doing so, he sold off the land that his grandfather had owned, which was in the center of the island with farming, growing some grapes, and was able to purchase vineyards on the north slope of Etna, which is where, excuse me, where he is today. Very old, well-established vineyards, that are contiguous, although scattered plots within that are found in his current estate. One of the 3 vineyards that he owns is Arcuria, and that's where this particular wine comes from today. The grape is a grape that is a grape that is indigenous to the island, Nerello Mascalese, and you'll see from the wine itself, quite light in color with a bit of a browning orangey rim to it. For a 2017, you'd think that maybe the wine is older, but that's not the case. This is just the color that one gets from this, rather in the way as one might perhaps get from a Pinot Noir. The property itself is about 52 acres, of which 36 are planted with vines on various volcanic soils. And he tends to prefer to treat the wines as naturally as possible, with no spraying, no herbicides, and because of the altitude, it's quite dry up there without heavy rains, and therefore lack of rot, and therefore doesn't have to use chemical herbicides. The nose is really interesting. It's gosh, there's a quite a bit of a sort of meaty quality to it.
To me, I got like a weird, not weird, just a very unexpected, almost like a Cointreau or triple sec type, orange liqueur-ish type nose.
Orange, yeah.
Like,
yeah. Fermentation takes place in cement tanks and in large, well-seasoned, rather like Silas was talking about up in Barolo, large 1,100-gallon oak casks. And in fact, he doesn't use any French barriques at all, because he feels that they impart too much of an oak flavor and too much of a micro-oxidation to the wines, and he'd rather they remain in these old casks, and that's what I was going to show you there. That's some of them. He has some much bigger upright ones as well. But you can see this almost looks rustic by comparison to what one might see in fact, the next property that I'll show you. But obviously, pristine hygiene in the cellars. Otherwise, we'd have some very, very funky wines that wouldn't taste nice at all. There's red and purple fruits, I think, I get on the nose. A little bit of tar, not as much as I got on the Piedmont wines. And 17 was not the easiest of vintage for them down there. It was pretty cold, and ripening was much later than usual. Though having said that, they don't harvest down there until late October, even early November, on average. I think the wine Now again, there's acidity, but it's not quite as bracing as Gattinara. There's a nice roundness, ripeness to the fruit, which really, I think, envelops the palate. It's not a hugely complex wine, but it's a really interesting wine. And I think, given a little more bottle age, this is really going to blossom into something quite exciting. I think it's ideal for drinking now if you wanted to do so. But for me, I'd suggest we put it aside and come back to it in about 5 or maybe 10 years. Silas, Gerard, your thoughts on this?
It's another one that's just got a lot of character, and just kind of speaks to how just much diversity there is across Italy, for sure. To your point, I think that you're probably underselling it a little bit by saying it's not complex. I mean, or not particularly complex. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I do think that it's a little bit more complex than maybe you perceive it to be. At least to me, I think it's a super fun wine. I mean, I think you certainly nailed it, that it's in a great spot now drink. It's nice to but it's gonna, I still think it's gonna develop. But just, it is another one of those wines. I mean, we have 3 in a row that, just, first of all, just, it's just a solid, well-made wine, but just speaks to how much the aromatics add to, just the overall enjoyment of the wine. It's a wine that you're getting just as much enjoyment smelling and trying to figure out what the heck is, what are those notes. But onto the palate, it's a nice wine for sure.
Yeah, I think I was doing the wine a disservice when I said it's not complex. Yeah, you can take me to task on that one, because there's a lot going on there. It's very interesting, because this and the next wine are both from grape varieties that many of us may not have had before.
Sure.
In the case of this one, I wonder how many of you even heard of it before.
No.
But it's certainly this region of Sicily is up and coming. There's no doubt about it. And just as a footnote, interestingly enough, on a separate portion down towards the south of the slopes, Grassi has teamed up with a quite well-known name from Piedmont, Angelo Gaia. Heard of him? So Grassi and Gaia have teamed up to start a brand new winery growing the same native grapes on the almost southwest area of the slopes of Etna. That will be interesting to follow. I don't think there's any wine that's actually been released yet, but it'll be fun one to watch.
Yeah, I completely agree with your all's sentiment. I mean, it's the minute I opened the first bottle of this wine for the samples, I was blown away. It reminds me more of Pinot Noir than a lot of the Etna Rosso I've had in the past, which, as you mentioned, is more from the southern slopes. They tend to be more extracted, so it tends to be darker in color. It tends to be a little anonymous, honestly. And this wine is, I mean, the color is beautiful. It's this shimmering garnet. The nose is this beguiling kind of sweet cherry, but it has a lot going on underneath that. I'm a huge fan, and I will probably buy a couple bottles. A couple to drink and a couple to sock away, as you said.
Yes. I think it's a really, really interesting wine, and one to watch for sure.
What's crazy is, I mean, the prices are pretty good as they stand, I think, for the quality. Like, this is their high end. This is their high end single vineyard, but there's already cult wines. Even Grassi, they make a tête de cuvée of this particular vineyard, and it's something like $180 a bottle. And similarly, the Cornelissen wines, the Magma, $200 bottle, $400 bottle of wine. It's Etna Rosso is definitely, I think, the next region to really blow up for Italy. It's gonna get wild. I mean, it's already getting pretty wild.
I think as long as, and this is certainly a good example, as long as the winemakers stay true to the grape variety and to the region, and don't try and make, as we have seen from some Etna Rossos, try and make a more international style.
I don't think they will, because it seems like the general attitude of the world market is actually going towards this kind of wine, which is, I think, very exciting.
Yeah. And should we be asked, the alcohol on this, according to the back label, is also 14.5. But again, there's no heat. There's nothing there that's going to make us think that this is a clumsy or a over extracted wine. Not at all.
Yeah, I think it's similar, where especially in cold, late ripening years, where they try to push the ripeness with these thins. I mean, Nerello Mescalese, another thin-skinned variety, where you're going to get that out. They're going to get the sugars skyrocketing pretty quickly when you approach ripeness. So you make that decision as a winemaker. I don't think I think it has great acidity. I think it has a really fine tannin, not nearly approaching the Barolo, but it has a kind of dusting of tannin on the tongue right at the end. I really like that.
Yeah, yeah. So should we move on? Southern Italy, if we, again, zoom in a little bit. These maps, by the way, are from Hugh Johnson's World Atlas of Wine. And so just to show you where we were, there's Sicily on the entire map. And you can see there's North Africa, and Sicily is, but as I was pointing out earlier, because of the mountainous climate there, I mean, there's snow in the winter, and it's cold. There are photos of vineyards covered in snow there. Anyway, southern Italy, so south of Rome, and we are going to move to the city of Naples and to another volcano, a little more famous perhaps, Mount Vesuvius. So here's Naples, the city of Naples and the Bay of Naples, and Mount Vesuvius, which is just tucked in behind Naples. And then up here in the foothills of the Apennine Mountains is the region of Taurasi. Taurasi is a region that is famed for the red grape Aglianico. That's Aglinico, but you don't pronounce, basically you don't pronounce the G, Aglianico. And I can skip to the next map where I've got, so there's Naples, and up here is the Taurasi region, or Campania, in the heart of Campania. And whoops, sorry, that's out of focus. Let's go back a bit. So here we have the Taurasi region, and we can see that there's the town of Taurasi itself. This whole region around here is Taurasi, DOCG Taurasi, and one of the most famous names in the Taurasi region is there, Mastroberardino. That's where they're based. Their vineyards are obviously not around the house, as might be the case in, say, Bordeaux, where your vineyards are around the chateau. But so 100% Aglianico, and there's your grape. Lovely shot of the grape in the fall, just before harvest. Fully ripe grapes, lovely plump bunch, pretty leaves, nice time to go there. So the wine we're drinking, the original offer that we sent out to you had a label of their Reserva Radici Taurasi, which is a buff white colored label. We jumped the gun because what we're pouring is the 2016, and the 2016 Reserva hasn't even been released yet. So we have here the Taurasi 2016 Radici from Mastroberardino. Radici is a given name that the property came up with, translates roughly as roots, and they associate the name with their connection with the soil, with the earth, with the vineyards, and obviously the growing of the grapes itself. The property of Mastroberardino, well, Taurasi itself was in real dire straits after the Second World War. There was financial, they'd have been depressed by financial depression, by phylloxera, neglect, and of course the war itself. And just after the war, Antonio Berardino, the 9th generation of the family, took over the running of the winery, and for the next 2 decades, made it his business to buy the vineyards they could find and dedicate himself to the restoration of the estate and to the ancient Campanian grape varieties that had fallen out of favor, apart from Aglianico. They have a white wine from Greco de Tufo and a Fiano, and Aglianico itself, which is the red grape of Taurasi, the grape that he was very prominent in saving from, basically from extinction. Aglianico is planted throughout Campania, particularly in the province of Avellino, which is also locally known as Irpina, and that's the sub-district that these grapes come from today. And it was basically due to Master Berardino's work that in 1980, in 1992, the wines got recognition as DOC and DOCG. However, in 1980, there was a major earthquake there, and it basically ruined all of the buildings that were part of Taurasi's, of Master Berardino's, excuse me. But that meant that they could rebuild, which is what they did. And there's a view of the vineyard sloping down towards the winery itself, obviously in the middle of winter. And again, you can see, even though you think it's Naples, it's not that far from the coast and from what we think of as being warm climate, southern Italy. There's lots of snow there. We'll come back to that in a minute. So having modernized and restored the estates and the building, it inspired him to begin sourcing fruit from one single vineyard, 100-acre vineyard that's been producing Taurasi since 1928. And in 1986 was the first vintage that they introduced Radici. If we look at the color of this, certainly compared to Etna Rosso, excuse me, much deeper in color. But again, with a slight watery rim, which would indicate a young wine. So it should be, it's 2016. Now that's an interesting nose. Wow.
I feel like we've said that about all four, but you're right. This one for sure.
They're all different, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like Taurasi, this is the kind of wine you put in a blind tasting, and it's a dead ringer. You know, it's like gravel and tar and asphalt is really the word for it.
So gravel, tar, and asphalt, and we think about those names, and we think about up to Piedmont and Barolo.
Yeah.
And indeed, the best wines from Taurasi are now often referred to as the Barolos of the South. Acidity is quite prominent on young Aglianico, which is again, we talked about this, the acidity is an integral part of a fine wine as long as it's in balance. And there's a liveliness, a freshness, good firm tannins there. Quite a long finish to it. So Antonio Master Berardino retired in 1997 and sadly passed away in 2014, but his passion and legacy are in the capable hands of his two sons and a winemaker that they retain. So they look after the winemaking, the vineyard, I mean, the whole thing. It's still very much family operated. And the two vineyards that are main vineyards are Monte Murano on the screen there, and Mirabella. Both, as I said, in the foothills of the Apennine Mountains, approximately 1,000 to 2,000 feet above sea level. Again, cooler nights, which we've all talked about, or Silas and I both talked about being very important for growing well-balanced and not overly extracted, overly ripe grapes. Again, harvesting rather like in Sicily, late October, early November, fermentations in stainless steel, and an extended period of maceration follows the fermentation. The wine is then aged for about 24 months in a combination of French barrique and large Slovenian oak casks, and then another 2 years in bottle before it's released. In the case of Reserva, the law says it has to be 3 years. As I said, I mean, Aglianico is certainly considered alongside Sangiovese and Nebbiolo as being one of the noble red grape varieties. I think there's almost a brooding quality to this one.
Very much.
Yeah.
It's there. It's just, give me a bit more time, it's saying.
But it's pretty intense. It's very intensely aromatic. It's intensely flavored. It's intensely acidic. But it all in a balanced way. It's pretty.
I get some black cherries, some spice on the nose, a little bit of black pepper. Yeah, that's really, really nice. So in May of this year, Venus.com gave this particular wine 95 points out of 100. And they said, an alluring, dark, earthy expression up front, which blossoms into a display of citrus-tinged blackberries, rosy florals, and a hint of animal musk. Coats the palate in silky richness, offering in polished black fruits, offset by cooling herbal and mineral tones as round tannins slowly emerge. I mean, I think that is a well-written review, because I think that sums it up. He finishes by saying, what a gorgeous Taurasi this is. It's Mastrobeardino, very, very much a name that you should look out for, not just with the Taurasi and the Radici, but with other wines from them as well. Again, a highly successful estate that has gained additional recognition because the Italian government chose Mastrobeardino for a special project, planting vines in the ancient area around Pompeii, to craft a modern version, obviously, of what they thought might be the historical wines that were being produced at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Hopefully a little less acid and a little more quality control in the vineyard and the winemaking, which I'm sure it will be. But an interesting footnote that rather like our friends in Sicily, they're being recognized as having great potential for doing much, much more than they are right now. The vineyard itself, the winery itself, after the earthquake, this is what they rebuilt. Those stunning Sistine Chapel-like ceilings and the oak barrels themselves, that's a bit blurred, I'm afraid, sorry about that. But, marble floors and these vaulted cellars, really, really interesting property to visit. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my pics and get back to you guys. If we have any questions, I'd be happy to share them and answer them.
You should. To me, this is definitely throw the poll up, and I suspect it's going to be split down the middle. I think because even if you ask me now and you ask me a minute or two from now, I feel like I'm going to waver back and forth. I think there's a lot to like about both these wines, ton of character, and ultimately it just kind of comes down to personal preference. I think we can all agree that these are super unique, well-made wines, but I'll be interested to see. I do think it's going to be a split, but personal preference. Yeah.
And any input from anybody as to, have you had either of these two grape varieties before, never mind these wines? Yeah. I think it's such one of the fun things about wine. We keep on discovering, we keep on finding new and exciting wines to share, to enjoy. And whilst I've had these a couple of times before, they're still very, very new on my wine spectrum.
Yeah.
It would be fun, not on one of our Zoom tastings, but it would be fun for you or for us to at some point put together maybe 4 different Etna Rossos and try them together, because I'm sure there will be huge differences in the winemaking styles. Yeah, Ken says he's had them both, really hard to compare against each other. Yes, but I was, we in putting this together, we obviously, all 3 of us discussed this, and it was two different grape varieties, but from the southern part, less explored part of the wine region of Italy, that we thought were both very exciting wines to share tonight.
Yeah, definitely unique wines. I think this is more instrumental than showing 2 Etna Rossos in this kind of tasting. But
oh yes,
I would love to taste. I would love to taste 10 Etna Rossos altogether.
I'll raise you in 12 Etna Rossos.
The question is, are there 12 worth tasting?
And
that I don't know the answer to.
Who's the guy that said it was going to be a split down the middle?
Look at that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Silas, maybe almost a tiebreaker with the pricing, but that's going to be a split down the middle as well.
That was wonderful. All right, there's one more.
I think Bob made a very, just a sound observation there. I mean, ultimately it comes down to, when we're voting obviously in a vacuum right now. We're not saying what wine would you like to have in the cellar, or what wine would you like to have with this food, or 6 months or a year from now. It's all about context. But yeah, I mean,
I should say I've been lucky enough to have a beautiful bottle of 1977 Mastroberardino Taurasi Reserva, and that was hands down one of the best bottles I've ever had in my life of wine. I mean, it was really pretty. It was still very concentrated. Yeah, and those older 1970s bottlings was the heyday of Mastroberardino before some inheritance issues created some vineyard loss in the 80s. So, I mean, if you find those bottles, drink them, buy them.
Yeah. Well, they I think probably occasionally come up in our auctions, not very often, but if you see them, make sure you bid on them.
Oh, where do you think I got them?
Yes, they don't get past the proofreading stage, is that right?
Oh, I split that with the customer. Actually, it was that important.
Well, that was a fun flight for me, because it's yeah, I've had the Radici before, and the Radici Reserva from older vintages, and it really does age incredibly well. I thought the Grassi Rosso, what a lovely wine right now. And
I can take it from here and take us home and kind of transition it into our Bordeaux-ish kind of tasting, or portion of the tasting. So with that, we'll transition into 2015 San Leonardo and 17 Ornellaia. So with these grapes, these are the ones that the majority of us will most likely be familiar with, because again, they're plays off of a little bit more international style, but for a lot of reasons, and we'll get into those, I'll get into those, the wines are just much different. First and foremost, this is another one where if you have some good lighting, you can throw it up against a sheet of white paper, or even just visually. I mean, I can even just look over now, my lighting is poor, and I can still tell that, the Ornellaia has, to me, it almost looks, almost has a bit of a New World kind of almost Napa Cab type look to it. Whereas I could definitely pinpoint visually, at least, and again, painting with a broad brush, because it's not to say that everything is visual, but I think that the San Leonardo definitely has a little bit more of an Italian look to it. And it's interesting because the varietal composition isn't all that different, which I'll get into. But I think I've thought of a lot of different ways to approach how to kind of go at these two wines. And I think first and foremost, it's important to just step back and remove the lines and just talk about the term Super Tuscans in general, or Tuscans, or whatever we want to call them, because sometimes even in the trade we're guilty of sort of misusing the term or using it when it doesn't apply. I think we all obviously know Tuscans, Tuscany, but there's been such a movement over the last 30, 40 years to a little bit more international style with some of these wines that are breaking the rules, breaking out of traditional Italian winemaking when it comes to the winemaking itself or the varietals that are parts of the blends. But the Ornellaia is literally a Super Tuscan, or it's a Tuscan. So despite the fact that the San Leonardo does use international Bordeaux varietals, needless to say, it's not in Tuscany. It is in Trentino, about 4 hours northeast, and I'll throw a map up there. So with that, I'll kind of get into where we're at here. So from a basic map perspective, you can see Bulgari there, which is specifically where the Ornellaia comes from, on the Tuscan coast there. And you head actually a little bit more true north than I thought. I thought it was a little bit more northeast, but up to Trentino, you're talking about 4.5 hours by car. I also think it's interesting to note that on the latitudinal line, Trentino, very much in line with Lyon, and actually more north than Bordeaux. So the San Leonardo, which hails here from Trentino, does have a reputation for being a very left bank Bordeaux styled wine in the truest sense. Not a really international wine, but very much some people would say a dead ringer for Bordeaux. We'll see how that kind of performs, but a little bit more north in Bordeaux, and then as far as on almost that same latitudinal line as Lyon, and Lyon kind of separates just a little bit south of Lyon is the tip of the northern Rhone, and a little bit north you're getting into Burgundy. So kind of just gonna give you an idea, and you can obviously see just how big Italy is in itself there. And then here, this is very zoomed in. Obviously, just this little marker here talks about the very extreme north. San Leonardo in the very south of Trentino. Everything up this way tends to be more of your white grape. So Alto Adige and a lot of your white wines from this portion of Italy come from a little bit north. San Leonardo has the benefit of being a little bit more southerly, just a touch warmer, and an absolutely stunning picture there. Almost like crazy how just and again, those are the Alps, the portion of the Alps back there, but just how idyllic is that? That's wild. And I will leave this up here as we talk a little bit more about San Leonardo. So the first vintage of San Leonardo was in 1982. They make about 75,000 bottles a year, which is a healthy production, but there's not a ton of it made. You'll see some of the other bigger name Tuscans make quite a bit of wine. This wine is, again, a healthy production, but nothing too crazy. What makes this wine super unique is the varietal composition. So it is Cabernet Sauvignon with 30% Carmenere and 10% Merlot. And it's the Carmenere that really, really separates this wine, makes it very unique. Interestingly enough, the 30% Carmenere, for the longest time, and since the inception of San Leonardo, the proprietors had thought that the Carmenere was actually Cabernet Franc. And much the same way that in Chile, the Merlot or the Carmenere in Chile was confused for Merlot. It's interesting that it also happened in Italy here. So you're working with for the longest time in Chile, they thought that their Carmenere, which is now their calling card, their signature, they had thought that was Merlot. Here, kind of same thing in Italy, where for the longest time they realized it, and actually. I found this kind of cool. Well, cool, but just kind of strange that they could actually label it that way, but despite the fact that they knew a little bit before changing the label, they still listed Cabernet Franc on the label. So if you look at older San Leonardo labels, you will see, or you'll see anything text sheets or stuff like that, or on the label, it would mention, Cabernet Sauvignon. It would say Cabernet Franc, but in reality, that was Carmenere and then Merlot. But generally speaking, that's always been the varietal composition. And the Carmenere, just kind of painting with a broad brush, it gives it a very nice herbaceous, almost vegetal, super unique quality to it. To me, it's not off-putting at all. It adds a lot of character to the wine. I'm a huge fan of the wines from Chile. I'm a huge fan of the big names, even the Dame El Cor, those type wines but even just 100% Carmenere. Now 100% Carmenere can be a little, because of that vegetal herbaceous quality, 100% Carmenere can be a little, like, it's not self-putting, but it's intense. But that's where it kind of speaks to how well the blends, these Bordeaux blends, or any blend for that matter, is all about balance. You want to have a little bit of that Carmenere character to the wine, but the Cabernet backbone, and a little bit of that Merlot to give it some plushness. So I'll talk a little bit more about the wine here, but just as another really, really unique wine. And it's got, to me, it has a little bit of, I wouldn't call it a Bordeaux nose by any stretch, but I would say that it almost has some, cedar type qualities. It's got definitely, to me, some dark fruit, not blue fruits, so not crazy dark, but a really, really unique nose. And I do want to taste this before we get into. That's a pretty wine, and to me, the Carmenere definitely pops out. There's just that almost like tomato leaf type quality that just adds a little bit of nuance and gives it a ton. I think it's a really, really nice wine. Another fun fact, another very relatively low ABV wine. The first vintage of San Leonardo in 82, 12% ABV. I don't think it's ever tipped above 13.5. So drink up multiple glasses. You don't have to worry about, those heavy Chateauneufs or those Paso Robles wines that, knock you on your butt after one. This is a nice wine to drink over the course of the evening. So just some quick history on San Leonardo before we transition over to Ornellaia. So their winemaking history goes back 1,000 years, but it wasn't until the mid-70s that the modern iteration, or the modern San Leonardo as we know it, developed. It was Carlo Guerrieri Gonzaga who studied winemaking in Switzerland and eventually found his way to Tuscany, where he began to work with a longtime friend, Mario della Rocchetta of Tenuta Sanguido, who was the maker of Sassicaia, and the great Giacomo Thais, who is the famed Italian wine consultant. And he was intrigued by what was going on in Tuscany and what were those early iterations of Super Tuscans, or soon to be Super Tuscans, were doing, and brought it back to Trentino, where in 1978 he planted the first Cabernet, and which would serve as, of course, as you can see on that sheet, the backbone of the San Leonardo blend. And then what's the last little nugget that I had? Interesting, it's only made in the best years. There have been 8 different vintages where they've deemed the wine not to be worthy of being made. So despite the fact that it doesn't say reserve or anything like that, which is typically what happens when best wines are only made in the best years. I mean, they won't even they won't make what they feel to be an inferior San Leonardo for a variety of reasons. I mean, there's been some years where there've been a ton of rain. Sometimes it was literally just the family who just decided they just weren't happy with the quality of the wine, despite the fact that conditions. And I think that to me speaks volumes. I mean, there's your real litmus test. I mean, it's obvious if you get a washout with rain or something like that, but when you can have something where, ostensibly the conditions were okay, and for whatever reason, it just kind of doesn't all come together and pan out to not bottle your flagship wine, I think speaks volumes about the family, and the fact that, I mean, it's crazy to think. I mean, this is one of the legendary Bordeaux influenced wines of Italy. Yes, it's considered an international style, but it definitely has some rustic, old school roots. And the wine's been around forever. And to think that you can get the wine for well under $100, and considering where some of the other bigger name Tuscans and other Bordeaux influenced wines, where those prices are going. I mean, to think you can get a wine of San Leonardo's caliber, and the wines age remarkably well, take on a ton of complexity. And even the 82, if you look and you get some people who have had the 82 in recent years, the original, the first year they launched San Leonardo, the wine is still holding up today. So, I mean, could be something to say for 82, which was, as I understand it, maybe a particularly decent vintage, a little bit west in Bordeaux. So, with that said, I will kind of pass it over to Silas and Simon, see what you guys think. But I think it's a really, really, and again, just another really unique wine that is both intriguing on the nose, but very much on the palate too.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this wine. I've had it a number of times, and each time it has this minerality that I think differentiates it from a lot of Bordeaux. It doesn't quite have that kind of cedar tobacco component, but it's balanced. It's juicy acidity, kind of what we were talking about earlier. With the Barolos, it has that beautiful acidity to it. Really nice tannin, fine tannin. So it has that kind of, you feel it, but it's so fine grained that it's not stripping. It's almost not perceptible unless you're looking for it. It's a lovely wine. And the fruit, I understand 15 was a warmer year. This still seems so restrained, but
Absolutely.
It has beautiful fruit to it.
Yep. Simon, you're on mute.
You're muted.
I think what was interesting to me was that when it was revealed the high percentage of Carmenere, sometimes Carmenere, as you said, can be overly aggressive in the wine itself, and this not so. This is really nicely balanced.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a wine that I could drink on its own, but I would love to take this to a steakhouse.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, by and large, San Leonardo gets, even if you read some of the, reviews literally on the 15 here of this wine, and just in general, I mean, not even just specifically the reviews, forget the reviews, just talk about, anybody, like their idea of like what San Leonardo means. They typically think of it, and most people think of it as a put it down and tuck it away in the back of the cellar and forget about it type wine. I think that this is I wouldn't say it's ultra accessible right now, but this is an enjoyable wine right now, for a wine that it has a reputation of going, every bit as long as, some classified Bordeaux. I mean, I think that the track record speaks for itself, and I think the wine's going to get better, but, obviously we're not having this with food. I mean, some of our participants might have some charcuterie boards. I do not. This is just a straight wine tasting, but I think even with that, I don't think that the wine is particularly, too assertive or aggressive. I think it's just I think it's giving us a little glimpse of where it's going to be heading in the next, handful of years and handful of decades.
I totally agree. I think it has the structure to age, but it's also, I mean, talk about hallmarks of great wine, is that it's balanced from the get-go. It's balanced throughout its life. It can age, has the ability to continue developing, but it's already beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's transition into what would certainly be the biggest name of the tasting, and that's the Ornellaia. Certainly one of the legendary Super Tuscans, and just kind of going back to the idea of what makes a Super Tuscan, what makes it have some of them have a Toscana IGT designate on the label. In the case of Ornellaia or Sassicaia, it's actually been narrowed down a little bit more to Bulgari Superior designate, so it's a little bit more narrow focused on the label. Very, very small portion of Tuscany. But Ornellaia, again, certainly one of the legendary and most influential wines in all of, certainly in Tuscany, but it has one of those wines that just has global appeal. The first vintage of Ornellaia, 1985, and the estate was founded by Lodovico Antinori, the brother of Piero Antinori, who is the man behind the legendary Tignanello and Solaia. And the goal, quite literally, was a sibling rivalry with the idea of Lodovico Antinori challenging, challenging his sibling, challenging the Sassicaia, which had put, the Sassicaia and Tignanello and Solaia, which had put the put Tuscany really on the map on a global level, and very, very confident that Ornellaia could do the same. And the 1998 vintage of Ornellaia was the Wine Spectator Wine of the Year. And the reputation that Ornellaia has that makes it a little bit different is that it is a little bit flashier, a little bit more opulent, and that is a large part due to the Merlot that's in it. And I don't have much on Ornellaia, but so even just that, down under winemaking, you'll see the varietal composition, which is 56% Cab, 25% Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Cab Franc. That 25% Merlot, the big belief in the use of new oak in the wine definitely gives it a little bit plusher. The Merlot gives it a little bit certainly of ripeness and plushness. The new oak definitely gives it a lot more modern feel. So to me, when I looked at the wine, when I smelled the wine, and when I tasted the wine a little bit before, and let's smell and taste now. To me, this is one of those wines that, of all, this almost sounds like a pejorative, but this is the first wine where I don't immediately go to the old world. With the first five, I think like, okay, I can't peg. I mean, let's be honest. Even for the three of us, I mean, I'm not going to smell the Etna Rosso and be like, that's not going to immediately take me there. But I can, I think we can all agree that there's definitely a lot of considerable old world quality to the first five wines. I don't particularly get that with Ornellaia, which is interesting because as Ornellaia ages, the reputation that it has is developing a lot more Bordelais characteristics and a lot more old world nuance. I think in its youth, the wine is a little bit more opulent, it's a little flashier, and it almost has a slightly California-ish quality to it. And I don't want to speak for the two of you, and I certainly don't want to speak for everybody that's joined, but to me, I think it's an exceptionally well-made wine. To me, this does, when we talk about wines made in an international style, this is where the obviously the varietal composition is important, but the winemaking style too. There's so many variables that go into how a wine performs and how the wine shows. But to me, this is something where I really wouldn't go immediately to the old world. I think it's a really, really beautiful wine. It's a delicious wine. And it's, to me, one word I would think would be polished. I think it tastes like a polished wine. Ornellaia has had remarkable consistency in winemaking, but the Axel Heinz has been the winemaker for, call it, the last 15 years, and he was preceded. The winemaker prior to that was Thomas Dureau, who is the winemaker now at Chateau Palmer in Margaux. So needless to say, big pedigree there, two big names. I mean, Axel Heinz has done great things with Ornellaia in the last decade and a half. Obviously, Thomas Dureau, I mean, his resume currently speaks for itself. But I think that to me, the Ornellaia, the polish is what is most noticeable. I think that this is a wine that, to me, was an hour ago, it needed this little time to open up and develop in the glass. I think that it certainly that speaks to how it's going to develop over the course of time in the cellar, but even just in the hour. Whereas the other 5 wines I thought were, willing to show their stuff. When I tasted the Ornellaia before we got on, the Zoom, I thought that it was, oh man, like I'm not sure how this wine's gonna show. But I think it's a beautiful, polished, to me, a little bit more new world than some people would think. I think, and I have some general stuff on the blend. So this real quick speaks to how much variance there is in Tuscany. So Sassicaia has always been a 2 grape wine, Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. The exact percentages have differed, but generally speaking, call it 85 Cab Sauv, 15% Cab Franc. It's differed a little bit. Ornellaia has blended the 4 varietals that we see there. Cab, the Merlot, the Petit Verdot, and the Cab Franc. Tignanello, much different. Tignanello flips it, and it's 80% Sangiovese, 20, and then a portion of Cab Sauv and Cab Franc. And then there's other obviously Super Tuscans, and I say obviously, it's not obvious. There's a lot of Super Tuscans that are 100% varietal. You haven't seen, I don't believe there's any 100% varietal cabs, but there are certainly some 100% varietal Merlots. Your Massetto, your Redigaffi, your Le Macchioli Massorio. So there's just a lot of diversity, a lot of different styles, even within Tuscany. And I mentioned before about the way it's labeled. It is to be a Super Tuscan, you're literally will have broken what were the conventional rules or the conventional way of winemaking over the course of many decades and generations. It's interesting to note that a wine that's made with 100% Sangiovese is not entitled, well, it wasn't for the longest time entitled to a Chianti Classico designate, because by law, there needed to be actually a small portion of indigenous white grapes blended into that. So, there are some wines that have 100% Sangiovese grown in Chianti that can't be labeled as such. So I think it's interesting and really kind of bringing back to the beginning of the movement to think that for 20 years, Tignanello, which was one of the trailblazing Super Tuscans, actually had to have a VDT designate, Vino da Tavola, that kept, so basically a table wine type designation, and I think we can all agree that Tignanello was anything but that. But for 20 years, they didn't even have the designation that they have now, which is a Toscana designation. To think that they were labeled as just a table wine for 20 years. But just kind of putting a bow on it before I turn it over to you guys. We vote and kind of wrap everything up. I just think that it speaks to how much how there are many Tuscans or wines that are made with these Bordeaux varietals, some of which can be very much true to Italy, and some of them almost by intention and by design are meant to appeal to a much more broad much broader global audience. So I think that again, Silas, well done on the pairing with these two. You're talking about 2 really, really significant, influential wines coming from 2 different parts of the fact that we did 2 Bordeaux blends, but didn't do all within the same. To think that we covered 2 parts of the country, well done. So nice job.
Yeah, I really wanted to show the breadth of international varieties within Italy. I mean, there's incredible variation within Super Tuscan community, but yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, it's staggering, the varietal composition, but also stylistic qualities. I'm a huge fan of these wines, and I mean the sorbet-like creaminess to this wine, the density of fruit. I would love to see it with more bottle age personally. I think the oak is not integrated quite yet, but with some air, it seems to blow off, and as you said, just some timing class even benefits it.
There's a real velvety quality to this wine. I mean, it's clearly very young, and as Silas just mentioned, No, the oak is not quite fully integrated yet, but that's okay. I mean, it's not overly oaky. The tannins are still firm, but rounded. But there's this gorgeous velvety quality to it that really rounds and softens it. Yeah.
And really, once again, really fine tannin. This has, I think, more tannin than the San Leonardo, more obvious tannin, but it's the texture. The texture is really nice, as Simon mentioned. Even though it's hefty tannin, the velvety fruit spills into velvety fine tannin, and it's really long and persistent wine.
Yeah.
But I think with this, with the San Leonardo, you're definitely getting that a little bit more rustic quality to me with the Ornellaia. You're getting a beautiful wine, but you're getting a little bit more polish, and it's by no means manipulated, but I mean, it's a lot of what goes into the wine. It's an exceptionally well-made wine. Again, this will be another, interesting one to throw up on the poll, because I think this kind of comes down to preference, stylistic preference. I mean,
and this is just an assessment of the two wines right now, not necessarily what they might be in 20 years' time. Yeah. Which of the two did you prefer right now? I think that's the poll. Is that correct?
Which is your favorite wine?
Can you vote? Of course you can. It's Chicago.
I personally, I tend to lean towards the San Leonardo at the moment, just because it is, I think, more balanced, just because the oak isn't quite integrated with the Ornellaia. But I would love to taste the Ornellaia with smage on it. That sounds great. Sign me up.
Silas, how are the numbers looking?
So we're looking at 75% Ornellaia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in fairness, the depth and complexity of Ornellaia does overshadow that San Leonardo, but the San Leonardo is really on its own a lovely, lovely glass of wine.
Yeah, and Rob did point out the San Leonardo is 2 years older, and that is actually by design. The San Leonardo, this is their most recent release, so they hold it back. They release it when they think it's ready.
Jose asked about comparing Sassicaia to these wines. Comparing Sassicaia to Ornellaia specifically, Sassicaia I can't. Maybe Simon can add some more historical context, but I tend to think of Sassicaia as something that, the Ornellaia is certainly young, but the Ornellaia can be enjoyed now. I think Sassicaia can be, to me, aggressive in its youth. I think Sassicaia needs quite a bit of time to be at its best. Again, no Merlot at all in the Sassicaia, and that dose of Merlot to me, adds a little bit of ripeness to the Ornellaia, which makes it a lot plusher and rounder and approachable now, for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, this isn't unapproachable. Pretty nice.
Yeah. Well, that was fun, Silas. Well done.
Yeah,
nice.
no, thank you all for joining us. I think that was a really fun tasting. I personally thrive off putting these kind of things together, and it's always a blast. I think wine shows best when it's in relation to other wine, and especially discussing it in this group setting is even better.
Yeah.
And seeing that kind of reference is it's how you learn about wine. And I learned a lot tonight, and I've had these wines on their own, and I have to say I saw them in different lights tonight.
No, I agree. And if I'm not mistaken, Silas, we'll touch base with everybody tomorrow, but all the wines are available, which is nice. And if I'm also not mistaken, 5 of the 6. The Ornellaia, I think everybody we know, as far as like where Ornellaia's gone with price. But if I'm not mistaken, the other 5 are well under $100, right?
Oh,
yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
very much so. With 3 of them being just around 50.
Wow.
That's the thing about Italy. Is like pedigreed wines. Like this is the highest quality we could get in these categories, really, for the most part, and well under $100. And that's the beauty of Italy. It's like when you get past the veneer of really cultish wines that are overpriced, I mean, you're talking about some real value.
Yeah. Do we have an overall wine of the night poll, or do we not have that?
Ooh, I did not build that one.
Okay.
Send your feedback to Silas when he, he'll send. We'll let you know what everything looks like, availability wise on the wines. But we would love to hear, or even throw it into the chat now. I mean, what the favorites were. Very quickly for me, I think the Scavino to me was my favorite. The Etna Rosso was the biggest eye opener to me by how much I enjoyed it for what it was, and just again, I mean, even being in the trade here, I mean, it's not every day that we're drinking a ton of Etna Rosso. So I think Scavino was my favorite. Etna Rosso was the biggest surprise to me.
I think I would tend to concur that from the point of view, I mean, certainly the Etna Rosso, though had it before. I mean, to put it up against some of these highly regarded, well-known wines, and it's my, yeah.
Yeah, no, I have to agree that Rosso was, I don't know if it was my favorite, but it was the biggest surprise. It was really, really nice. And I want to taste their reserve, but I don't think 180, I don't think I'm ready to spend that quite yet. Maybe we'll see about Christmas bonuses.
Hint, hint.
Silas, do you know, as far as the Taurasi Reserva, do we have access to other vintages of Taurasi?
I believe the 14 is the most recent release of the Reserva, and I don't know if it's available.
The 16 is apparently now in New York, having just recently landed. Not that we own any yet, but it is now in New York, and if we want to get a price and send that out at the same time tomorrow, we can certainly do that. And it if it's in New York, can be here within a couple of weeks probably.
As Simon mentioned already, this regular Credici, I mean, highly pedigreed wine, 95 points from Venice, and definitely less expensive. I highly recommend it. As you tasted tonight, it's a lovely one. But the Reserva, had it a few times, phenomenal wine. But yeah, thank you all for joining. It was lovely tasting, and keep an eye out. We're going to be doing, sprinkling in, in-person tastings and more of these virtual events. But the reach we can have with people is phenomenal. And someone did mention hoping we could avoid Wednesday nights. We only did Wednesday night because of the holiday.
Yeah, so, we did it for the holiday. Yeah. Sorry, Denise. Sorry to keep you from the press wine night.
Yeah, we will be going back to Thursdays. Don't worry. And yeah, keep an eye out for future tastings. Hope to have you. Yeah, thank you all for joining.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good night.